1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings 18, we'll read verses 41 through verse 46. And Elijah said unto Ahab, Get thee up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of abundance of rain. So Ahab went up to eat and to drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Carmel. And he cast himself down upon the earth, and put his face between his knees, and said to his servant, Go up now, look toward the sea. And he went up and looked, and said, There is nothing. And he said, Go again 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time that he said, Behold, there ariseth a little cloud out of the sea, like a man's hand. And he said, Go up unto Ahab, prepare thy chariot, and get thee down, that the rain stop thee not. And it came to pass in the meanwhile that heaven was black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. In James chapter 5, James is speaking of the duty, the need, and the importance of praying. And in verse 13, he mentions beginning with verse 13, he mentions different circumstances such as affliction, sickness, and sin. And he calls upon God's people to pray. In verse 13, in the context of affliction, he says, Let him pray. In verse 14, in the context of sickness, he says, Let him pray. In verse 16, in the context of sin in others, he says, Pray one for another. He then states a fact. The effectual, that is, the effective prayer, or the effectual fervent, speaking of the manner of praying, of a righteous man, the condition of the one who's praying, availeth, helps, benefits much, or largely, to a great extent. And by way of encouragement to this duty of praying, as an example, he mentions Elijah. He says Elias was a man, subject, prone to like passions as we are. That is, affected by the same things that we are. Subject to the same sins, the same weaknesses, the same shortcomings, the same feelings, the same fears as we. He then makes reference in verse 17, again to encourage us in this matter of prayer. And he, that is Elijah, this man like us, prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And again, by way of encouragement in this matter of prayer, what he says in verse 18 of James 5 is what is being referred to in our text. We see Elijah prayed for rain. And we read in verse 45 of our text, and there was a great rain. We want to take the thought from Elijah's words to Ahab in verse 41. There is a sound of abundance of rain. And that's our subject, a sound of abundance of rain. Rain, we may not think much of it, but rain is one of the great things, the unsearchable, marvelous things of God. Notice in the book of Job, chapter 5, verse 8, I would seek unto God, and to God would I commit my cause, which doeth great things, and unsearchable, marvelous things without number, who giveth rain. That's one of these great things, unsearchable, marvelous things that God does. Who giveth rain upon the earth, and sendeth waters upon the fields. Notice in chapter 36, verses 27 and 28. For he maketh small drops of water. They pour down rain according to the vapor thereof, which the clouds do drop and distill upon man abundantly. Rain is a miracle of God. It's one of the miraculous works of God. In order for it to rain, water has to be carried up into the sky and then poured out from the sky. And this is a great, unsearchable, and marvelous thing. We're told that 1 inch of rain on 1 square mile of land is over 27 million cubic feet of water, which is over 206 million gallons. Better be glad God doesn't just drop it all in one place. Which is 650 billion pounds of water. 1 inch of rain over a square mile. And it's all carried up into the sky by the process of evaporation. It's what God uses to do this. What this means, what evaporation is basically, is water sort of, kind of, stops being water for a while so it can go up. In order to come down, condensation happens. Water starts being water again. So in order for it to rain, God carries incomprehensible amounts of water into the sky. He removes the salt, otherwise it would kill plant life, carries it great distances, and then sends down the water, or sends the water down in drops. Big enough to fall 1 mile or so without evaporating, and small enough to keep from crushing life below. God is the maker of the rain. And every time it rains, it is a miracle of God. God is not only the maker of the rain, He is the governor of the rain. He determines where and when it'll fall. Genesis 7:4, He said, I will cause it to rain upon the earth for 40 days. That's God governing the rain. In Genesis 8 verse 2, the rain from heaven was restrained. Who restrained it? God did. He's the governor of the rain. In Leviticus 26:4 and Deuteronomy 11:14, I will give rain in due season. In due season. In Psalm 147 verse 8, He prepareth rain for the earth. Matthew 5:45, He sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. Jeremiah 5:24, the Lord our God that giveth rain. God gives rain. Jeremiah 14:22, a question is asked. Are there any among the vanities of the Gentiles that can cause rain? God's the governor of the rain. And it goes on, art not thou he, O Lord our God? Therefore we will wait upon thee. In Amos 4:7 he says, I have withholden rain from you. And then later on the verse he says, I caused it to rain upon one city and caused it not to rain upon another. So make no mistake about it. God is the maker and God is the governor of the rain. Now if we go back to 1 Kings 18, we need to consider the setting of the text. The northern kingdom of Israel had continually ignored God's calls to repentance. And King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel, had brought Israel deeper than ever before into sin, leading them into the depths of Baal worship. As a result, due to the sin of idolatry, the land came under the judgment of God. And we read in verse 2 of 1 Kings 18, there was a sore, or a very severe and distressful famine in the land. No dew nor rain for over 3 years. The crops had no doubt died in the fields. No doubt much of the livestock had died and was still dying. Wells had dried up and were continuing to dry up. Rivers and brooks, we've already read of one brook that dried up, have dried up and were continuing to do so. People, no doubt, had died due to the famine and were continuing to die. Everywhere you went, there was dryness in the land, bareness, devastation, death. No doubt it was a time of great grief, time of anguish, time of poverty, tremendous loss. And hopelessness would begin to set in, and futility. And people would become very restless. So there's this widespread devastation. And as you look around, if you were to look upon people's faces, no doubt you would see uneasiness, you would see some sadness, you would see great stress. You no doubt would see worry and confusion. I see the people pleading before the statues of Baal. You would see people marked by physical weakness and frailty. You'd see a people who's just struggling to continue to live. It is a time of great need. They are in desperate need of rain. In 1 Kings 18, verse 1, God tells Elijah, while Elijah was in Zarephath, it's going to rain. Go tell Ahab. It was Elijah's job to tell Ahab it wasn't going to rain. And now it's Elijah's job. You go tell Ahab it's going to rain. So Elijah receives this message from God. It's going to rain. Elijah believed what God said. I mean, after all, God had already commanded the ravens to feed him, and guess what? It happened. God commanded a widow woman to sustain him, and that happened. So when God tells Elijah, it's going to rain, Elijah believed the message. And that message found lodging in the heart of Elijah. The message is very simple. God is going to make it rain. God is going to send rain. Now this is followed, he tells Ahab, and this is followed by a meeting with the people upon Mount Carmel, a confrontation with the prophets of Baal, and God manifesting himself in a mighty way upon Mount Carmel. In verse 40, Elijah brings the prophets of Baal to the brook Kishon, which ran by the side at the bottom of Mount Carmel into the sea. So he's come down from the mountain. And there the prophets of Baal were slain. In verse 41, with this message of God burning in his heart, God is going to make it rain. He says to Ahab, he sends message to Ahab, you'd better get to the high ground. There is an abundance of rain coming. Elijah knows something that contradicts everything on the outside. It's going to rain. That's the message that's in Elijah's heart. It's so engraved in his heart that the message to Ahab is, there is a sound of abundance of rain. In other words, Ahab, it's going to rain, and I can hear it. I can hear it. Ahab couldn't hear it. Why? He wasn't the one God gave the message to. But Elijah has this message burning in his heart. God's going to make it rain. And in spite of the fact that there's not a sign of rain anywhere, Elijah believes the message. So much so that he can hear the sound of an abundance of rain. So here's Elijah. The message of God is within his heart. Elijah, I'm going to make it rain. And this message burning in his heart, verse 42, Elijah went up to the top of Carmel. So he's back on top of the mountain. He's there with this message, with this promise from God. God is going to make it rain. And that's so working in his heart that he can hear a sound of the abundance of rain. And what does he do? Well, it says he cast himself down upon the earth and put his face between his knees. And then what does he do? He prays. God has given him the message. The message is in his heart. I'm going to make it rain. So what does Elijah do? He prays for rain. You know when the message of God is burning in your heart when you pray. That God will do the very thing He said He'd do. That's what Elijah's doing. So here we are. Again, those words. A sound of abundance of rain. Elijah can hear that. Now here we are in a day. There has never been so much outside noise as today. So much and so many have access to us through the noise of Facebook, Twitter, television, computers, phones, jobs, newspapers, on and on we could go. But you know what you need to do sometimes, very often, is shut out all the outside noise. If God's people, for one day, most couldn't do it for 5 minutes, but if for one day they would just shut out all the outside noise and just listen to God, oh, what a difference it would make. To shut out all the outside noise and hear God. And hear what God is going to do. It tells us in this book what He's going to do. But we let all the outside noise drown out the sound of an abundance of rain. So Elijah has heard God. Elijah, I'm going to make it rain. And Elijah so believes that message that he can hear a sound of abundance of rain. That is, he is absolutely certain it's going to happen. And he prays for the very thing that God promised. The Lord has promised He'll come again. By the time you get to the end of the book of Revelation, we are to pray, even so come, Lord Jesus. How many people are really God's people truly praying for the Lord to come? Most don't even think about it. They don't even think about the Lord coming. They're all caught up with all the outside noise. And that's all they hear. But we need to so believe that the Lord is coming. I can hear the trumpet. That's where Elijah is. He could hear the sound of abundance of rain. So he cast himself down upon the earth, put his face between his knees. He's in a position before God. A position of reverence. A position of humility. With a burdened and submissive heart. And we see him there with his face between his knees. And he's praying. James tells us he's praying with vigor. There's energy. He's praying with zeal, determination, and diligence. That's what the message in your heart will cause you to do. All the other noise will just cause you to worry and cause you to be angry. But the message of God in your heart will cause you to pray. Elijah, absolutely certain that the rain is coming, instructs his servant in verse 43, you go and look toward the sea for a sign of coming rain. It's going to rain. No sign in sight, but I can hear it. You go and look toward the sea. And while Elijah's praying, the servant went and looked toward the sea and returned. And he said, Master, there's nothing. Nothing. This happened 6 times. And each time comes those words. There is nothing. But Elijah could hear a sound of abundance of rain. There's nothing. 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 Shut out that voice. Shut out that noise. God said it's going to rain. And Elijah hears. It's like Elijah never even heard. There's nothing. Elijah hears a sound of abundance of rain. What do we hear today? That's not a hard question to answer. All you have to do is listen to people talk. It's very obvious what they hear. It's very obvious that's all they hear. God help us. There's nothing. Nothing. But louder and more convincing in his heart and his mind was this message of God. I'm going to make it rain. And louder in his heart is the sound of abundance of rain. Sound of abundance of rain. Oh, did you hear what so-and-so said? Did you hear what God said? That's my question. Yes, I heard what so-and-so said. But shut out that noise for a while and listen to what God says. And have that engraved in your heart, so much so that you can hear the coming of the promise, whatever it might be. You see, that sound of abundance of rain prevails over. There's nothing. Elijah's saying within his heart, every time the servant comes back and says there's nothing, Elijah says in his heart, I know it's going to rain because God said it was going to rain. God is going to make it rain. I know it's going to happen. Even though there's nothing, I know it's going to happen. It doesn't look like it's going to happen, but I know it's going to because God said it was going to. That needs to be us. Oh, things are looking mighty dark. Things are looking mighty dark. Shut out all the noise for a while, folks, and listen to God. And have the message of God engraved upon your heart. God said He was going to make it rain. And Elijah says, I know it's so. There's nothing. Nothing. That's information coming into Elijah. Nothing. Oh, we get a lot of information. Some of it's true, some of it's not true. But we get a lot of information. You know what you need to do sometimes? Is shut out all the information. All the outside information and just listen to what God says. That's all the information that Elijah needed. It's going to rain. I know it's so because I can hear the sound. So he climbs that mountain. gets down before God and prays. The servant returns the seventh time, in verse 44. Behold, there ariseth a little cloud out of the sea, like a man's hand, shaped like a man's hand, perhaps the size of a man's hand. Elijah gets excited. And filled with assurance, he tells his servant, verse 44, go tell Ahab he'd better get moving before the rain stops him. Notice verse 45. And it came to pass in the meanwhile. Oh, what God can bring to pass. People have said, God's people, I know what God says, but there's no sign of it happening. There doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be. You just need to believe. Go tell Ahab he better hurry. And then we see the heaven was black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. From nothing, 6 times, nothing, to a little cloud, like a man's hand, to the heaven was black with clouds, and from no rain to a great rain. Oh, what God can do. He is the maker of the rain. He is the doer of the miraculous. God did what He said He would do. He always does. And yet we're surprised when He does. Elijah is greatly strengthened. Verse 46, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. And he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. That's approximately 17 miles. He's running in the rain. God strengthened him. And I promise you, the message of God engraved on your heart, you just keep believing God's going to do what He said He would do. You're going to be strengthened. You're going to be strengthened. But you may have to shut out all the outside noise for a while. So Elijah went from praying for rain to running in the rain. And I believe in that 17 miles, Elijah is enjoying the rain. He's enjoying the miraculous blessing of God. He's in the reality of the rain. The reality of the blessing of God. That's a good place to live. And there is Elijah. And I believe he's praising God in the rain. God said, I'm going to make it rain. And now Elijah is living in the abundance of the rain. Living in the abundance of what God said. So in closing, we all have droughts. We all have times of emptiness. Times of dryness. Times of bareness and desolation. Elijah went from dry to soaked. From dry to drenched. God can do that. We all have times of difficulty. We all have times of trial. Elijah serves as an example in such times. He believed God. He believed God. Do you see what's happening? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, why don't you start with believing God. That's a good place to start. Just believe God. Just believe the message of God. And though there was no answer in sight, and though everything seemed contrary to what God said He would do, he so believed it that he could hear a sound of abundance of rain. Ahab, there's a sound of abundance of rain. And he prayed. He pleaded with God that God would do what He said He would do. That's what we're to plead. We're to plead the promises of God. Pouring out his heart to God concerning the promise of God. And this is what he heard. There's nothing. There's nothing. But drowning out that there's nothing was the message of God. It's as if Elijah is saying, oh, there may be nothing, but I can still hear a sound of the abundance of rain. I know it's going to rain because God said it would. God said it would. Here's what most would do today. God tells you it's going to rain. You pray for a couple minutes. Someone comes with some bad news. There's nothing. And if you're really spiritual, you'll keep on praying for another few minutes. And then there's nothing. And then pretty soon that's all you hear. That's all you hear. There's nothing. And I'm convinced today that that's all most of God's people hear today is all the outside noise. That's all they hear. That's all they hear. No wonder they're so hateful. No wonder they're so angry. That's the only information they're getting. But all to be a people with the message of God engraved on our hearts, that believe in spite of all the outside noise and all the outside information. God said, and I believe it. That's where we need to be. Can you hear? Can you hear a sound of abundance of rain? Elijah refused to be discouraged by the outside noise. There's nothing. There's nothing. We're so addicted to the outside noise, God's people can't even come into God's house and shut it down for an hour. Can't do it. It's impossible. They will not do it. I got to have this information. Got to have it. They're distracted by all the outside noise, by all the outside information. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we need to completely avoid outside noise. That's not what I'm saying. But you need to hear God and not get addicted to the outside noise, the outside information. We need to be like Elijah. God said He would, and I know He's going to. That's all I need to know. Elijah knew He's a God who can. There may not be a cloud in the sky, but God can make it rain. And He's a God who will. We need the message of God to so work within us that we hear in an overpowering way. That we hear it in such an overpowering way that it overpowers all the other noise. You can't help but hear the outside noise. A lot of it we invite in, we just can't get enough of it. But you can't help if you walk around, hear some outside noise, hear some outside information. And most of the noise is very upsetting. It's very upsetting. But the message of God isn't. It's encouraging. It's encouraging. And here's something else I've found. You listen to the message of God in such a way that it overpowers the outside noise. Those who profess to be God's people will soon consider you the enemy because you're not listening to all the outside noise. I don't need to. I don't need to. The outside noise is not what's to shape my life. The message of God. The message of God. So, that God would so engrave it upon our hearts that the message of God overpowers all other noise. All other noise. And you could turn it around. God, you've got sin in your life and God tells you to repent. Someone else comes along, the outside noise, and says, oh, you're fine. You need to hear God. Shut out that outside noise. Other people telling you how great you are, how wonderful you are. You need to shut that down sometimes and just listen to what God says. There's an awful lot of people that would rather hear the outside noise than hear what God says. That's just a fact. They'd rather hear the outside noise. And I believe there's people who claim to be God's people who would rather get angry and stay angry over the outside noise and get happy over the message of God. That's just the way they prefer it. God help us that we would hear a sound of an abundance of rain. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us